Welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams Burch, and this podcast, it exists for you. Whether you're a music lover, an educator, a choir member, each week we bring guests to the show to help explore what matters in music. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams Burch, and today you're going to meet Dr. Bridget Sweet. Dr. Sweet is a vocal specialist, a choral educator extraordinaire, and a specialist with adolescent voices. Yes, you read right. This episode is titled, "The Larynx Is Not a Vagina." But in this episode, Dr. Sweet will explain where that came from and how normalizing the why behind the adolescent voice change empowers and equips your singers. We also spend time talking about the voice and health of the teacher and the singer, you, the person listening right now. So I hope that you enjoy this wonderful episode with Dr. Sweet. As always, this podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, Kinnison Choral Company. If you want to make life-changing moments in rehearsals and performances, check out their choral rehearsal tracks. These packages allow your singers to rehearse the nuts and bolts of the music at home effectively, letting you create long-lasting musical memories with your singers. And they've given you a very special offer just for listening to this podcast. Go to KinnisonChoralCo.com and use the coupon code MUSICMatters at checkout for 20% off your first order from their library. You will not be disappointed with their full mixes, their rehearsal tracks, their mute tracks, all of that jazz. You're going to love it. Before we jump into the episode, one more thing. Dr. Sweet and I talk a lot about female and girl voice change, and I want to make sure you know that this means assigned at birth female. And so we're talking about the actual mechanism inside of the body. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send us a message so that we can answer them. But now, it is my absolute honor to introduce you to one of my newest friends, Dr. Bridget Sweet. Today on the Music Ed Matters podcast, we welcome one of my newest friends, Dr. Bridget Sweet. Hello, Dr. Sweet.
Hello, thank you so much for having me today.
I'm so excited to finally meet you. I feel like I know you thanks to Instagram and your amazing post. How's The Mandalorian?
Oh my gosh, we finished it last night, and oh my gosh, all the feels. Yeah,
Yes,
it was really wonderful,
episode.
and I think it was really awesome too at the end, like the last two episodes especially. Like there were all these really strong women, and it was like him on this ship with all these really strong women, and just it was fun to watch with my children and just think about that. So
Yes.
And Baby Yoda, please,
Oh
can't
my
get
gosh,
enough.
so cute. Sometimes when my dog jumps, his ears do the little thing and they fly out to the side, and I'm like, he's doing the Baby Yoda. He's doing the Baby Yoda. It's so great. How old are your kiddos right now?
My son Luke is 9 and he's in 3rd grade, and my daughter Evelyn is 6 and she's in 1st grade.
Those are great ages. I just did an honor choir with 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, and those 3rd graders were precious. Just so studious in a way. It's such a great age, and you can't beat a 1st grader. The whole world is amazing to a 1st grader.
They're really sweet. They have very big personalities, and they like to make me laugh, which is really awesome. So yeah, they're a lot of fun.
Great. Okay.
So my husband actually got me this Baby Yoda doll for Christmas.
Really?
It's kind of like it reminds me of a Cabbage Patch Kid, the way it's made. And so the kids and I have been like propping him up around the house. Like he's
it's like
watching
Elf on the
us.
Shelf, but better.
Right. Yeah, we're having a good time with it. Yep. So
That is so fun. Okay, so you have 2 kiddos, an awesome husband, and I think you're on sabbatical?
I am on sabbatical right now this semester, which
How
I've
does
never
that
done
feel?
before. It's the strangest experience of my life so far. It's
Okay,
been really
enlighten
great.
those of us that have never had a sabbatical.
Well, what I found so far, and I've only been doing this for like a week and a half or so, when a lot of things fall away, there's a lot more space to there's been things that I've been pushing off in my brain or in my heart for a long time that are coming back. Or like now you have space to focus on me. And, it might be things like self-care or really thinking about the workload that I carry on a regular basis and what, what's best for me. And just thinking about myself in this profession and in my trajectory and so forth. Like it's been so far right now, it's been just really kind of overwhelming and with having space to actually stop and really think And I've got a bunch of projects that I'm planning to work on, which I'm really, really excited about. So it's not that I'm not happy to be away from teaching for the semester because I do love teaching my students, but I'm really happy to have the chance to work on some of the projects that are really important to me that I don't typically have this kind of time to work on. I feel
Right.
very fortunate to have this opportunity.
And you'll come back an even stronger teacher if that's even possible. I've heard nothing but fantastic things. Tell the listeners, what is it that you do? Who is Dr. Sweet?
um, I am associate professor of music education at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in Illinois, and I taught middle school choir for a long time in Michigan, and yeah, and so I've written two books. The first book is called Growing Musicians, Teaching Music in Middle School and Beyond. And the second one is called Thinking Outside the Voice Box, Adolescent Voice Change in Music Education. So for me, from the very beginning has been about empowering adolescent people and really trying to change the perspective in the world to glass half full versus glass half
Mm.
empty for the age group.
This is totally why we are friends. I love that perspective because there's a great quote. One of those self help people talk about it where you have a glass. I believe it's Darren Hardy and the compound effect. But he talks about protecting your glass, and everyone has a glass. And you can choose to put clear liquid in your glass, or you can let your glass get muddy. But whatever's on your glass will impact what's in your glass. So, is your glass half full and clear and beautiful and the best version? Or is it muddy? And are there things that you need to filter out of your glass?
That's really interesting. I've not heard that analogy before, but I like it.
I'll send you a link to the book. Also a great book, but you could read the cliff notes and get just as much out of it. He kind of
Okay.
is repetitive for those of us that
Okay.
weren't listening the first time, because you know we all have those students. He must have been one of those.
Well, I appreciate that.
So there are so many things we could talk about. I know that I want to save the body mapping conversation for another episode. I definitely want to have something fully focused on that. But I'd love to talk about adolescence and the voice change, especially females. I have a community youth treble ensemble, and I have a few girls that are in the depths of that change right now. I'd love some advice.
So I have in the past years, a lot of my work has really focused on trying to empower those females in our choirs. So the quick and dirty version is that several years ago I was asked to write a chapter for an Oxford handbook that looked at qualitative research on choral music studies in the United States. And so basically, which really wasn't that many since the start of qualitative research, which is in like the mid 80s. Um, so I went back and did a literature review and wrote this chapter. And what I found was there was a lot written about male voice change and nothing about female that was qualitative research, peer reviewed protocol, research protocol. And so what I decided was, and along the way, one of the studies that I found actually by Patrick Freer, which is a great study, but one of the things he said was the choral music profession is not meeting the needs of male changing voice singers, evident by the lack of numbers of males in our choirs. And I chewed on that for a while and I thought, well, but just because we have lots of females in our choirs, that doesn't mean that we're meeting their needs. We can't automatically invert that. So I got a grant and I went to North Carolina to the Durham School of the Arts, and I did a year-long study there, specifically focused on adolescent female changing voice. And I mean, anecdotally, we've talked about this as teachers. I mean, I taught middle
Mm-hmm.
school choir for a really long time, and I knew that there was something that was happening with their voices, and the profession largely discusses Lynn Gackel's, stages of adolescent female voice change, but that was more anecdotally based versus like following a really strict research protocol.
Right.
So I decided that I wanted to do that. And so that was the first of its kind. And it was a phenomenological study. And basically, that study was intended to just validate, again, through research protocol, that this was a real thing, that girls
Mm-hmm.
actually did experience voice change and that so much of what was happening to them, the girls used the same words that the males had used in studies on male voice change, in describing their own experiences, like frustration and, um, and fear and anxiety and empowerment and, awkwardness and like all these things. And so from there, then I did another study that looked at, so there was this research where they talked to men about their voice change experiences as young people, but no one had done that with women. And so I
Okay.
did that with college women. And what I found was, that in that study, the same sorts of things, the symptoms, all of those sorts of things came up again. But I also found that females, and again, I'm speaking assigned at birth female, I should mention that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I should have mentioned that earlier. But the students that I spoke with, the participants, they talked a lot about how as female singers in their choirs, they was used more as a tool to meet the needs of the music than they were about their own individual development.
Oh.
And so there was a lot there about self-sacrificing, um, and if they were wanting to try a different part, either
Mm-hmm.
some of them talked about being in actual physical pain from singing a specific voice part
Mm-hmm.
or wanting to do something different. They didn't want to talk to the teacher about that because out of fear of diminishing the larger choir.
Oh,
And
wow.
so there's this huge thing about advocacy that that these participants were not, feeling that they could do anything about their voices. So it was like they had no figurative control over their literal voices. And so
Mm-hmm.
I did another study after that with my colleague Elizabeth Parker at Temple, and we talked to 39 college women about, we were looking at vocal identity, the whole idea of like voice parts and identity and so forth.
Right.
And we actually found whole new study, whole new group of people. We found the same results that I found in my second study, that
Really?
these people were being assigned to a voice part according to what the choir needed, that their teacher was very ensemble centric, and that there was little discussion or effort towards their own individual vocal development within that setting.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, we think that like we have lots of women in choir, but we're not meeting their needs according to the results of these studies. And through this work too, I also wrote my second book, which is specifically focused on thinking about voice change for adolescents outside of what's just in the larynx. So if you go to all of these Facebook groups, which I have such a love-hate relationship with on the voice and singing, and people will say like, I'm working with middle school students and I've never done this before. What do I need to know? 99.9 times out of 100, the people will say, you need to know Lynn Gackel's 1991 stages of female voice change or John Cooksey's 1977 stages of male voice change. And for me, there is so much more to working with adolescent singers than classification of their
Mm-hmm.
voices, which really shouldn't even be a part of this conversation. And so that was really a lot of the impetus for writing that second book. So it is about, the first chapter is all about the adolescent. I talk about brain development, emotional, cognitive development. I talk about physical things. I talk about hormones.
Mm-hmm.
This whole second chapter is about the vocal mechanism. It's about, um, what happens when it functions normally and then what happens during adolescent voice change. And I also have a whole section dedicated to premenstrual vocal syndrome, which
Mm-hmm.
is a thing that voice science and voice performers have known about for years and years and years and years and years, but nobody's talking about it in choral music ed. Um, so I'm actually working on a study right now. I'm putting together all the final touches of the IRB paperwork to
Mm-hmm.
do a study about premenstrual vocal syndrome, because what it is it's basically hormone fluctuations in our body, um, impact how our voice works. And voice scientists have proven that on a cellular level, the cells that make up our vocal tissue are the same cells that make up our sex organs. So when we have hormone fluctuations as, biological female people, um, the tissue in our vocal folds swells. It affects stamina, it affects mucus production, it affects, range and suppleness and flexibility of our voices. And I don't know about you, but I don't know very many adolescent girls who have regulated cycles. So if we as adult women are experiencing,
Right.
fluctuations of our voice every month, like these adolescents on a, not only is the vocal tissue growing, their vocal folds are elongating, the larynx is growing, lung capacity is changing, and on a cellular level, hormones are changing the function
Mm-hmm.
of that tissue that they use for singing. And to me, that's mind-boggling. And there is nothing there that classifying a kid, alto, soprano, bass, tenor, that there's nothing in those classification systems that are gonna meet
Right.
the needs of a
Address
kid.
that
It's
individualness.
we're
Like it
just
was,
not.
I had no idea that that was a thing until I was getting my doctorate, and there was a soprano voice major next to me who just an amazing pedagogue, an older student, so she knew a ton. And one day she leaned over and she goes, "Sorry to ask, are you on your period?" I'm like, "Oh, that's the most awkward question I've ever been asked." So we talked about it, and so that became our joke. She would tell me where I was and why my voice, and it to a T, she could articulate what was going on with my voice. And so when I would then direct that choir later in the next year, we had so many conversations outside of class of how I could better vocal model when my voice sounded raspy or airy or got tired after an hour. So I'm so glad I can't wait. So when you're just doing the IRB, what's your timeline for this one and who are you studying?
So what I want to do is I want to talk to um, I'd love to talk to high school students. I'd love to talk to college students, and I'd love to talk to teachers who are using their voices on a regular basis um, and keep track. The trickiest thing is trying to figure out how this works because everybody's cycles are a little bit different, and have them keep
Mm-hmm.
track at different points in their cycles for maybe 6 months. And while they're keeping track of like kind of the day of their cycle, and then there's like these little check-in points also detailing how their voices are feeling that day and things that they're noticing,
Mm-hmm.
and discuss other sorts of symptoms and things that are going on. Just again, to validate it by research protocol in music education.
I love this.
Um, and I think it's really, it's amazing. There's some wonderful books out. There's a book called The Female Voice that came out, and it's I think Abbott Ball wrote that. I might be wrong. Um, but it's all about the life cycle of the female voice. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
when we're working with pregnant singers, when we're working with people who are later in life who are having
Mm-hmm.
declining hormone levels in their body, it's affecting vocal
Mm-hmm.
tissue. And these just aren't conversations that the choral music profession is having. Like when I
Right.
go to these giant conferences, most of the time my stuff gets rejected for being presented at these conferences, and I go to the conferences and they're like 10 things you didn't learn when you were in college, and I want to be like, we're
This
not
is
having the
such a
right conversation.
right. Oh, I'm
So
so glad I know that this is your space because I would love this is such an important concept both to the students I'm teaching, to the choir kids I have, and for the listeners. This is just to kind of blow your mind that this is another aspect instead of classifying, which may help you as like a crutch in the beginning. What you're saying is better understanding of the process and the why.
yeah. So the other thing too is I am not anti-voice classification system. I'm really not. And I say that at presentations, and I have that written out in my book. But my problem is that how we just use that as kind of the fix all in our
Mm-hmm.
profession for female singers especially. And I think that people will get weirded out. I've had people leave my presentations when I start talking about premenstrual vocal syndrome, or the fact that like the larynx looks like a vagina and we need to get past that and show videos of it and pictures of it. And they're like, but my kids will think that it looks like a vagina. So what? At least now they know what it looks like.
Right.
They'll never forget it. It'll be the best conversation they've had at dinner that night with their families. You're not going to believe the pictures that, Mrs. Sweet was showing in class. Like we have to stop. We got to get over ourselves a bit in our
Mm-hmm.
world, and we need to teach about the instrument biologically, physiologically. We don't need to say to students, where are you in your cycle? But we need to tell them that hormones and hormone fluctuations are going to impact the way that their voices function, so that if
Mm-hmm.
one day it feels weird and they don't know why. That's the hardest thing about voice change, is the unknown.
Right.
So the best thing that we can do as teachers is to make the unknown known.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not a hard thing to do. We show videos
Mm-mm.
and we do it. constantly. It can't just be like a one and done. We have to constantly put posters up in our classroom. We need to show these videos of larynx and I can never say the right word, laryngoscope,
Yes.
videos, and have them understand the parts and pieces, because adolescents have no control over so much in their lives. They have no control
Right.
over so much going on in their lives. But if we can give them information, that's power. And it makes the
Yes.
whole experience so much less scary if they understand why their voice is cracking. If they understand that, like, it's just everything's just all out of line in there. It's a growth spurt of an organ that's the size of a walnut with huge implications. And if they understand that the reason that their voices are cracking is because, like, one side of their vocal folds grow 2 millimeters longer than the other side at the moment, like, there's nothing wrong with them. We have to
Right.
normalize it. And as
Yes.
teachers, I think we don't like to teach about it because we're uncomfortable, because we either don't know, we
Mm-hmm.
can't get past what it looks like. My students actually gave me, and there's a picture of it in my second book. My grad students gave me a laryngeal model, and it has
Yes.
at the bottom, they had it engraved, and it says in quotes, "The larynx is not a vagina."
That is such a great present.
It's one of my most prized possessions, and I think so then the other piece of this too that I talk about in the second book is like the societal stigmas against adolescents. And every portrayal that we see of them in pop culture, in TV shows and movies, is all
Mm.
mortifying and embarrassing,
Mm-hmm.
and voices cracking, and just horribleness. And
Awkwardness.
right? And so
Mm-hmm.
one of the chapters I actually go through and talk about a couple of different episodes of specific television shows that span 40 years. Got the
Wow.
Brady Bunch and the Wonder Years and the Goldbergs.
Mm-hmm.
And just take a look at the way that voice change is portrayed and adolescence is portrayed, and thinking about the fact that teachers are steeped in that perception, our students are steeped in that perception. So before they even get to school, they already have made up their mind that this is going to be just a horrible experience and mortifying, and that no one will think that they're worth anything.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I was transcribing the videos for that chapter, my kids would come and stand behind me, and they'd be like, "Well, what's happening to him?" So I had to explain voice change. But then I also had to say, but like, what you see in this television show isn't exactly what happens. It doesn't have to be this bad
Right.
and this scary. Like, even my own kids were automatically starting to learn from what they were seeing. So,
Wow. So how do we flip it? You've already talked about using the categorization, but moving beyond that, thinking outside those boxes. What are some tangible tools we can walk away from this episode with to equip, empower, educate, and help our adolescents?
so if we think about like a Swiss Army knife, and like classification systems are one of those tools. They're like the nail clippers or something. But like the other thing is we have to, first of all, we have to honor voice change for all students, and we have to explain to them that this happens to all of you, and for all of you, for assigned at birth females and assigned at birth males, it's going to be easier for some, and it's going to be very hard for some.
Mm-hmm.
And that there should not be some like severity threshold that students must reach before we give it attention.
Right.
That we have to revisit this conversation often. So there's lots of stuff out there about how to meet the needs of male voice changing singers. The same things exactly apply to our females. We need to voice test often. We need to allow them to advocate if their voices aren't feeling great, and allow them to recognize what's happening. We need to talk about anatomy and physiology in our classrooms so that they understand what's happening, so it's not so scary. Because
Mm-hmm.
like, that's the scary thing too, is at this point in our lives, if we're adolescents, we're also being asked to make decisions about scheduling in high school and moving forward. And if we're at this time of great physiological development, and we have no control over how our voices work, and it's scary because we don't know why things are happening the way they are, and someone comes to us and says, "So hey, do you want to sign up for choir for the next 4 years in high school?" and they're not
Oh
feeling good
no.
about that, they're going to say no.
Right.
Who would want to put themselves, sure, I'm a
No.
glutton for punishment, I have no idea what's happening and I'm miserable, but why not? Like, so we
Right.
have to think about that. This is the long game. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
the other thing too. We have to talk to our singers, like their voices will not fully finish developing until their 30s.
Right.
They're going to have adolescent growth, and then there's going to be all this ossification and calcification of the organ. So like we're talking about, a good 20 years that
Super
students
long
will
term.
develop vocal development.
And we have such an opportunity to share that with them. On the flip side, you made me think about this because here I am in my mid 30s and I feel like my voice is finally doesn't sound like a 12-year-old. Like, it's so exciting. I remember opening my
Congratulations.
mouth, thanks, like 32. I'm like, whoa, where did this adult voice come from? I'm so excited.
Yeah.
How can I take good care of my voice? Can we flip it and start talking about some strategies for teachers and all of those type of things?
Sure. So just to give your listeners, this is not just Bridget's opinion. I teach a class at Illinois called Healthy Music Practices, and we do a lot of discussion of vocal health and wellness. And the old term used to be abuse and misuse, and that's not what voice speech language pathologists use anymore. They call it phonotrauma. And so
Oh,
because automatically it just made it sound like the person who was having vocal issues was responsible for what was
oh,
happening, whereas actually
yes.
this it's not always the case, because there's things like acid reflux or different sorts of conditions that are out of your control that
Mm-hmm.
can influence your voice. So for example, things like medications that we take can influence, and I would encourage anyone, if you do not know how the voice functions at kind of a basic level, go to YouTube and just look up vocal folds function or larynx in action, so that you can really understand what's happening. The other thing that you need to understand is like that the larynx and the is part of the trachea, which goes to the lungs, and that is literally right next door to the esophagus, which goes to the stomach. And so there are some implications about those two tubes being right next to each other. So it's good to understand that anatomy and physiology if you're really interested in the voice. Um, so medications that we take, if you go on Google and you search, there are websites where you can find out the ramifications of medications that we take on our voice. So if we're taking hormone supplements or anti-anxiety medication or just vitamins, some of those things could be dehydrating,
Mm-hmm.
and we will get advice on these websites to up our liquid intake or to be on the lookout for signs of acid reflux or things like that. So it's important to think about everything that we put into our body um, can impact how our voices function. And so that can go to medications, or any sort of recreational drugs. Then when we get into the idea of like smoking, um, smoking is one of the worst things that we can be doing or around for our voice, because if we think about it, the vocal tissue is part of the larynx, which is part of the trachea, which connects down to the lungs. And so when we inhale, we always see pictures of like black lungs when we see pictures of people smoking and so forth, but we don't ever see vocal fold tissue. If you
Ooh.
stop smoking, your lung tissue will regenerate and they'll get pinkier again. But vocal fold tissue is non-regenerative. So once it's damaged, that's it. That like there's no healing of it. If scar tissue should form or something like that, like there's nothing you can do once you damage your voice and your hearing. Those are two things that we need to be a lot more conscientious about in our
Mm-hmm.
profession. So if you're inhaling, the smoke is going between your vocal folds, down into your lungs, and then back up again. So I also tell people, be careful if you're around a lot of like stage production, if you're around
Right.
a lot of special effects smoke, if you're working in a place where there's secondhand smoke. But even like perfumes or things like that, if you're working in Bath and Body Works, like everything that you're inhaling is going between your vocal fold tissue, which may dry you out, which may,
Mm-hmm.
lead to some other things like coughing or clearing your throat, which can then lead to issues with your voice or
Right.
so on and so forth. I think another thing to think about is the hydration issue is something that the Center for Disease Control and the people who put together the food pyramid and so forth there are no formal recommendations in the United States for how much liquid a person should intake.
Really?
So there's a food pyramid and there's exercise guidelines, but there's nothing in regard to fluid intake because every person is a different shape and size. We have
Okay.
different body mass, bone structure, height, weight, and also climates where we're living. And, things like if I eat a bowl of soup every day for lunch, that sort of a thing. Does that count if I eat a watermelon? So
Mm-hmm.
it's very hard. But the biggest rule that people can follow is to pee pale, to make
Yes.
sure that your urine is not bright yellow,
Mm-hmm.
because that is an indication that you're dehydrated.
Right.
Um, but I think if you're noticing anything with your voice, one of the things that drives me crazy is that people would rather just suffer in silence. And so if you notice that you're chronically coughing, you might have an acid reflux issue because the acid is leaking up the top of your esophagus and dripping down the top of your larynx, which causes you to want to clear your throat.
Mm.
If you're noticing that you're having any sort of limitation with regards to range you can sing or any sort of stamina issues that are not normal, do not wait longer than 2-3 weeks at the most. You need to see your doctor, because if you have some sort of node or some sort of polyp or some sort of cyst, you need to find that out soon, because what then happens is you develop unhealthy habits by like
Right.
speaking louder, or you then end up doing things in unhealthy ways to overcompensate,
Mm-hmm.
which then just makes it's like then the just snowball just keeps rolling downhill. So I encourage people, if you're having any issues at all, to go get it checked out. And then the biggest thing for us, is to stop talking. But I know you and I already talked about like I like to
It's
talk,
impossible. I
but
love it. I love it.
thinking about if we think about like the one of my favorite things I've ever heard, my friend who's a speech language pathologist in New York, he told me, like, I like to think about, I wake up every morning and someone hands me a stack of Monopoly money, and that's all I have is all the voice I have for the day.
Mm.
And so thinking about like over the course of your day, where are you spending the most money? And if you use your voice a lot, do you immediately get in the car and then sing along with the radio? Like you're using voice dollars that you don't need to be using.
Right.
And so that's a really good thing, I think, especially for teachers, especially for singing teachers.
Such a great
Um,
analogy.
we tend to self-sacrifice ourselves. And what I tell my students is like, you have to decide when your students come and leave your classroom if they're going to leave you whole and ready for the next group, or if they're going to leave you broken.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, you have to take charge of your own health and wellness, and you want to be in the best shape that you can be, because your job is not your life.
Yes.
You work to
Say
live,
that
but your job is
again.
not your life. Yeah.
Yes, that is so good. And I love how just listening to you give these little tidbits as from the teacher perspective. I'm feeling empowered and equipped. And I bet that is so much like our adolescent singers as you say these things. And these are things that we've all heard before. I remember
Right.
being a freshman in undergrad, and one of the voice faculty got up and said, "We take Tylenol, not Advil. Let's say that all together. We take Tylenol and not Advil. One more time, you have a hangover, you take Tylenol and not Advil." It was a big joke. And then we all had to turn in a piece of paper with like how many ounces of water we committed to drink, like as a joke. It was totally a joke.
Did they tell you why you should take Tylenol, not Advil?
Something like the Advil dries out. Something I don't remember.
It's actually Advil thins your blood.
Okay.
And so if you have any sort of veins, some people have veins that are close to the surface of their vocal folds. And there's a name for that condition. It's like a clesius or something like that. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But you can pop blood vessels while you're singing, if you have this condition where the veins in your vocal folds are and your tissue are too close to the surface. And then if you're taking Advil, it thins your blood, which is more apt to lead to some
Wow.
sort of like rupture
I just
of your
assumed it
vocal
had
fold
to do
tissue.
with drying out, but again, look, the
Yeah,
empowerment of knowing the why,
yeah,
which is, I think, what we go back to here.
yeah.
Using our resources like your books, like this, listening to this podcast, doing the research, going deeper than classifications, providing the why to ourselves, to our students. There's so much that can be done when you know why.
hmm
Such an
I
empowerment
absolutely
issue.
agree. I absolutely agree. And if we
Oh,
can't answer the why question as the teachers, then we have work to do.
right. just ask somebody. Going back a
Yeah.
couple seconds ago, don't suffer in pain. Don't self-sacrifice.
Yeah. No
Well,
suffering in silence.
no. You've already given us so much great information, but I always allow the guest something like a nugget, the one big thing that matters at the end. What would you like the listener to remember above all things?
Okay, well, I don't want to leave with the larynx is not a vagina, although I think that's an important one to leave with.
That might have to be the title
Might
of
be.
the episode.
You totally do that. I said that's going to be on my gravestone.
I love it. Well, we have to normalize using that type of language.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree. Yeah, I think for me, the nugget that I always tell people as singers, as teachers, as musicians, as whoever they are, you need to be your truest version of yourself and not try to be a cookie cutter version of anyone else.
Amen.
Because you're who you're supposed to be, and you make the world a better place because you're you. And if we spend too much time trying to be like everyone else and trying to be what we think people want us to be, then we really miss out on a lot of the joy and opportunity and discovery. And I think sometimes I feel like I'm wacky or, like a little off the beaten path, which makes me a really good person to work with adolescents. But I realize that like that's me and that's who I am, and when I embrace it, my life is so much more fun and enjoyable than if I try to like be who I think people think I should be. So just be you, I think, is probably the most important thing I try to teach my students.
I love it. And it ties in so perfectly to what you've taught us today. If you force your students to be the cookie cutter choir that you want, if you sacrifice the individual for the whole, we should make every person feel important. The episode that comes out right before this one is all about collaboration and collegiality with Dr. Jeffrey Benson from California.
And I love Jeff. He's great. Yes, he is. Yes.
We went to grad school together. He got his doctorate and I got my master's at the same time. And when I interviewed him, I said, it's kind of like interviewing royalty because you were a doctoral student. And I told him I was interviewing you and he goes, oh, you guys are going to hit it off just fine. He was great. But he said the importance of the Maya Angelou quote, how do you make them feel? They might remember what you say, they might remember what you do, but how do they make you feel? And I think what you're saying is the perfect connective. The next step is be you.
Absolutely.
I love it. Oh, I'm so glad to have finally met you, even though it's virtual.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're going to be back as soon as you finish that body mapping certification. I want to bring you back on. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's nothing else to say. You be you. Empower yourself, empower your singers, and keep doing great things, my friends. I'd love to have you join the conversation over at patreon.com/musicedmatters. Please let me know what you're thinking and how you're enjoying the podcast. It is such a joy to be your host, and I am really, really thankful that you're listening. I can't end without saying that you know you matter. We all know that music matters. And I'll see you next time on the Music Ed Matters podcast.